Welcome everyone to Cape Ann Art Waves. I'm Christine Fisher, your host today. Our program is coming to you by way of 1623 Studios located in Gloucester, Massachusetts. My partner in crime, fellow co-producer Jacqueline Genham DeFalco will join you next time. But first, we want to thank our listeners and our sponsors for their generous support. They are Prince Insurance Agency, M.K. Fisher, visual artist, Martha K. Anger of Compass Real Estate Brokerage, Protective Packaging, Cape Ann Savings Bank, and Coming Pro. We simply cannot do it without them. So our deep thanks. We also want to thank our partner C-Arts, who do a terrific job with our marketing, and to 1623 Studios, who broadcast and distribute our show. Thank you all. We also want to send out a nod of thanks to local musicians Steve Lacey and Pat Verga for their original music that is provided at the beginning and the end of our program. Cape Ann Art Waves is all about bringing forward and learning from our area's uniquely gifted artists and makers, shining a spotlight on their artistic journey and work. It is really my honor and pleasure to have on the show today someone who has made an indelible impact on Cape Ann and the broader global community through her art and as an educator. Susan Ernie's CV is impressive and very extensive, having participated in countless solo and group exhibitions in Europe, Canada, and the United States. Her work is in numerous public and private collections around the world. Today, she is represented by the Matthew Swift Gallery here in Gloucester. As a side note, I had Matthew on as my guest last fall. He does such a great job in support of our artists. Having received a formal education at RISD, MassArt, and Lesley University, perhaps it is Susan's early formative years, growing up in Brookline, Massachusetts, that set the course for her acute sensitivity, her purposefulness, and the impressive body of work that she has accomplished to date. In addition to working as an artist, Susan has been a curator, art writer, lecturer, teacher, and consultant on the role of art in society and its uses educationally. I have a quote here that I want to read that I think will set the table very nicely and will give us all some early insight into Susan. I have always been a reluctant artist, and maybe because when I make art, I also obsess about meaning, existence, and inhumanity. I can't seem to separate them. And I have always questioned what kind of contribution I could make by spending my time creating objects with no tangible purpose. So I have tried doing other things, but nothing in life has ever meant as much to me as visual art. It has been my solace and refuge. When I am making it or viewing it, it is where I experience awe in my life. It is the means by which I best process ideas. It is necessary for me in order to have any sort of peace in my life. Art is something that I cannot not do. I want to welcome Susan, and I also want to acknowledge that you have been viewing a beautiful, very arresting piece by Susan that has been behind me that I am going to ask Susan to kindly explain, titled June 6, 1975. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much, Christine, and to all your partners as well for making this possible.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, this piece is one of several. It's actually part of a triptych. And then there were other pieces as well on Disappeared in Chile. Mm-hmm. Now, Chile was one of the countries in Latin America that went through very hard times in the 1970s. In 1973, there was a coup to overthrow the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende by General Pinochet. Mm-hmm. As an American at that time, and then probably later, there was, when it happened, I thought, oh my God, America. And then because we were supporters of Pinochet, Later in the 80s, a lot started to come out about the disappearances in Latin America. And I knew someone who was going down to Chile who brought back materials for me to use for research. They had been collected by the Catholic Church. So out of those materials, there were countless pictures of people who had been disappeared. And the thing about disappearances was that it was a new technique used by authoritarian regimes to literally wipe people off the earth and their identity, their existence, everything. So there were no records of the disappearances. They were literally made to disappear, and families could not mourn. I felt that I had to remember some of these people and to put them in front of other Americans, actually. And so I worked with the images that I had, the materials I had for 5 years, eventually chose some images. And in 1994, I think, is that right? Yes, 1994, I started to work on pieces, including the one you can see now. It's a large piece, you know, it's like 64 by 54 inches. It's acrylic on charcoal on canvas, but it is then covered with burnt paper and other materials, and then framed in lead and screening. And basically what I was trying to do when I finally finished the piece in 2006 was to make the figure come out and disappear to the viewer. So that was my goal with this piece, and the eyes really are the focus of the piece. Well, and so what I could do with this piece was feel good about having at least tried to be a witness.
Yes. Well, and you challenge us all to remember as well, Susan. You challenge us to remember. Let's back up a little bit, because I think this beautifully sets the tone for our conversation going forward. Let's talk a bit about your younger years, your childhood in Brookline. Here, I thought you had grown up in New York.
Everyone does. You know, my father was a refugee from Ukraine. My whole family, other than my mother, you know, all my grandparents were Ukrainian refugees. They came to America. The last one came in the 30s. And I think that was actually my father. But the house I grew up in Brookline, and it was a typical immigrant story. My family had settled in Dorchester, right across from the park on Blue Hill Avenue, Franklin Park. And that's where my mother grew up with her parents. And, you know, then like other people who started to feel like they wanted to get out of the city, they moved to the suburbs. And Brookline happened to be a place where there were a lot of Jewish people. My family is Jewish, as am I. And so they moved to this community that felt really safe in Brookline with mostly Jews. I think I went to grammar school with 2 non-Jewish people.
Wow.
So what did I know about the world beyond my neighborhood at that point? Not much. And then reality hit. I did have an aunt who lived in New York who was constantly politicizing me. So that was the first really strong influence. My father's mother got furious at me if I said anything that at all smacked of any kind of racism. She actually spit at me once.
Wow.
And she was a refugee. And fortunately, she understood what that meant. And so I ended up thinking, really, I was religious until I was 13. And after that, not. And I really thought from my family, okay, if I'm Jewish, it means I have to work for social justice. So I got involved with the civil rights movement. And that's where I really not only learned a lot, but figured out the kind of role I wanted to have in the world
Mhm.
as best I could.
And that you've been very true to.
Tried. I've
Yeah.
tried.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I don't know if you want me to talk about school or anything
Yeah,
now.
please. Why don't you give us a quick, I mean, you are so richly educated. Please give us some highlights. Yeah.
Okay. So when I went to college, basically, I decided I would be a sociologist unless I got into Rhode Island School of Design, and then I would be an artist. I mean, it was that ridiculous. And it was the 60s, you know, we did not think practically.
Mhm.
So I went to RISD because I got in. And after a year, I realized it was, although it was a great school, it was really not the right place for me, partly because I wanted to be able to afford my own school and not take money from my parents. And so I transferred to Mass Art, which, believe it or not, was $200 a year at the time for Massachusetts residents.
Mm.
Graduated from there with a BFA. And very soon after that was invited into a training program through Odd Channels to become a lay group therapist.
Mhm.
And this was the 70s, which was a crazy time in psychology.
Mhm.
And I was trained, I became a group therapist, and then went on to get a master's. I had an art degree, so I had to go to a school that would accept experience as a credential. So I
Mhm.
went to Lesley University. I got a master's in psychology. By this time, I was in my early 30s.
Mhm.
And I was planning on going for a PhD in psychology. I was looking at schools, and my brother almost died. He was a little older than me. He didn't die then. He spent a long time doing so. But I woke up one day and thought, you know, I'm going to be in my 60s, which then seemed very old.
Of course.
And I won't have done the thing I cared about the most, which was making art. So in 1984, I went back to painting, got a job as a goldsmith, which I had been trained in, or I'd been trained as a jeweler and worked in that. And I started to paint again. And, you know, basically that's a lot what I've been doing ever since. So I'm always trying to stop being an artist. I have always tried. And when I moved to Gloucester, which was 1995 for 4 months, and I'm still here, as you can see, you know, it wasn't great for my career as an artist, but I found all these other facets of the arts that I was getting involved in. So I started to be asked to curate shows by places who knew my work and knew me in Boston and then in New York. And I ended up becoming a curator at the Cape Ann Museum for a couple of years. And I've been doing stuff since, you know, as you know, I was at Sea Arts for a couple of years. I've written, I've taught, lectured.
Let's talk a little bit about the role of abstract expressionism. Those artists and how they have impacted your work, because I want to continue and really dive into your fabulous work here that we're going to talk about.
When I was growing up, my heroes were the abstract expressionists, Rothko, Pollock, not really Helen Frankenthaler then, although I like her work a lot now.
Yeah.
I wanted to be an abstract expressionist, you know, and every era in art school, there's kind of a school of art that's the academy. And when I was in art school, abstract expressionism was the academy. And from those artists and the general gestalt then for the arts, I never looked at art as did they not, the abstract expressionists initially, as a way to make money. It just never even entered my mind that I could make a living that way. And, you know, one of the problems with art for me was that I couldn't make a living. So I went on to do other things. That's why I became a jeweler, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But abstract expressionism, interestingly, sort of stayed with me in a way that I didn't understand, because when I went back to painting after 14 years of not doing so, I decided I had to train myself to be a realistic painter, because I thought what was wrong with my abstract work was that it didn't have the training I felt I needed behind it in depiction, composition. I mean, the doing of it.
Right.
To give an internal logic and structure to the way I thought about my work. So it wasn't until many years later that I painted abstractly at all. And now I go back and forth.
So on that note, Susan, let's talk about this piece that is, you know, quite amazing. Your tank.
Oh, the tank,
from
yes.
1985. I mean, talk about.
I was early.
Yes, let's talk about that and the influence of that piece. And then what I'd like to do is to move on and talk about a number of different series of your work. So let's use this as the jumping off point.
I love my M60 tank. Yeah. I mean, I never see it because it lives in Canada, but it's 5 feet by 3.5 feet. It's the first piece that I actually did just to do a piece on a certain theme. And at that point, Reagan was president, the military budget was being discussed, and the numbers were like telephone numbers. You know, I mean, it was so much money, nothing compared to today, but so much money. And I just kept thinking, you know, do people really understand what this money is for and what these implements of war really do? So I thought, if I paint a really big war machine and put it in front of people, maybe they'll think about it.
And it's big.
I don't think it works, Christine, but that's what I did. And that's what I do a lot. So I wanted to find a tank that I really loved. And I did a lot of research. Unfortunately, most of the tanks I really loved were German World War II tanks. I know it's funny to talk about loving a tank, but I love industrial objects. And I couldn't use those. So I was looking at American tanks and I found this tank, the M60 tank, which was the main battle tank in Vietnam. Still used around the world in poorer countries. It was a great tank. But the key to it for me was also that it was the last example of a conventional weaponry tank. So this, as opposed to technological.
Right.
So I had this other theme going through my head and that I was starting to work on, which was the history of the Industrial Revolution in America, because I thought, well, we're going into a new era and maybe we should think about the pros and cons of the industrial age so that we can foresee something about the technological age and maybe prevent something bad. So this tank not only fit my goal for the specific painting, but also my greater goal of sort of talking about the effects of industrialization on America.
Right. Well, as you shared with me, one series informs the next.
Yes.
So let's continue. Yeah, I want to talk about, but Take Another Abraham.
It's kind of a crooked path from the tank to Take Another Abraham.
Yes.
It's very much there. So as I was working on the theme of the Industrial Revolution, you know, things came up about the impact of industrialization.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, coming out of the tank, its impact on war. And people talk about the Holocaust as the pinnacle of industrial murder. There's been plenty of genocide, all of it beyond horrible.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing about the Holocaust was that it really was industrial. It was the most efficiently designed system to kill people.
Mm-hmm.
And use them as for what they could be used until they were killed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's especially horrifying to me. At the same time, I thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to do work on the Holocaust, which I did not want to do. I did not want to spend my life with that material. I eventually did, but on the way there, or even after, I decided to as well look at what was lost in that event, in that series of events. And part of what was lost was this incredible cultural flowering. Jewish society had gone from being mostly a religious society to a lot of secularization after emancipation in Europe. And the it was then Czechoslovakia at that time, between World Wars I and II, was an incredible example of the secularization of Jewish kind of pursuits and culture with German culture. This is one of the biggest tragedies to me. I mean, what came out of that coming together was an amazing cultural flowering. Well, one of the prime examples of that time was Franz Kafka's work. Franz Kafka, as you probably know, was a Czech writer who really wrote about the absurd. And so his work presaged, though he died before World War II, but it presaged the kinds of awful stuff that came out of bureaucratic society, industrial society, and the dehumanization of society. But Take Another Abraham is a piece that looks at, you know, my culture, I suppose, through it's a parable. Kafka categorized his piece on Abraham as a series of parables along with other parables. So these are short-ish pieces. And those were pieces that I could work with on one visual image, and also gave me the opportunity to go deeper into the use of text in art, which I'd done before, but not to the extent I did with But Take Another Abraham. And that piece is done to look like a page of text.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So would you say that was a pivotal piece for you? Because
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's how it impressed me as well. I'm going to keep things moving, Susan. We could talk in such depth about each one of these. Let's talk about the Zumas.
The Zimas.
Oh, so sorry.
It's okay. The Zimas, this goes back to the Holocaust. The Zimas, which I painted in 96, were a family that was murdered in Poland right after the Germans invaded and World War II started in 1939. So the whole family was rounded up and put in a building and burned. I think it was their home. And the reason I have the photograph, which I did this painting from, and this is, you know, again, looking at the culture and what was lost. So the photograph, I should say, interject, is from before World War II. And the painting is depicting that. Everyone in that photograph was killed except for one son who had left Poland in the late 20s and brought the photograph to America with him. And by that time, I was in the middle of doing 11 years of research and work addressing genocide and crimes against humanity in general. And I met many, many people and ended up exhibiting and speaking because of these many people in places with the work I was doing on genocide. And so the Zimas were the family of one of those people. And my goal was to do 8 portraits of families before the war who were killed. But this was the third one I did. It was the only successful one of the 3, I thought. And I couldn't paint for years in oil or do a portrait after that. I mean, I finally could, but it was probably 10 years. It just did me in. Because paintings take over, as you know.
Right. Well, you demonstrate a great deal of courage doing the work that you do. You do.
Do it to save my mental health, Christine.
Well, we can go off on a tangent about that because I'd love to know more about what you do to relax your mind.
What's that?
Let's keep going. You've got another piece here. Let's talk about the history of eugenics.
Oh, yes. Well, that fits right in here.
Yeah.
Again, this was when I was doing all this research. That was, 94? I know this work is all very early, but it all leads up to the later work. And basically, at one point, I thought, I'm an American. I actually lived in the South End at the time I think our building was one of 2 with anyone white in it. So it was, a pretty downtrodden neighborhood, and a lot of people would not visit me there. But I felt like here I am, a white person in a primarily African-American community. And I really, I need to do something about racism in America. But I have to do it from the point of view of a white person. And a participant in that privileged racial group in the country. So what I did was I really delved into the history of where racism goes back to in terms of its intellectual underpinnings. And that's eugenics, which really has its roots around the Enlightenment. This piece is taken from, it's after, I guess would be the term I would use, a chart done by a late 18th century Dutch anatomist named Petrus Camper, who was a total Enlightenment man, anti-slavery. But like many Enlightenment people, he wanted to understand society, and he thought he could do it through rationality. So he came up with a theory of measuring people's skulls. Now, to determine why white Europeans were the smartest people. Because that was what he knew.
Right.
So the thing is, here was a humanist whose work was in medical textbooks, and used to support the most horrible racial theories and treatments of people, both in England, in America, and in Germany. So eugenics was a term coined by Francis Dalton, who is Darwin's British cousin. And it was basically pseudoscience, race science. And, it's the movement that we see not family trees, but hierarchical trees of human worth coming out of. It was taught at Harvard. It was like main medical theory. The United States was the homeland of it until the rise of Nazism. And the Nazis looked to America for their models, including their sterilization laws. So it's a very rich history. It's a very informative history. And I wanted to do a piece that was part of the historical record. And that's what this piece is, that encompass this. Oh my God, this is where it started.
Your paintings, they all have their own voice, Susan. I mean, they really do. They really do. I want to keep us moving here.
Yes.
More rich work to get to. Let's talk a little bit about your studio practice, and then we've got 3 images you'd like to cover as we talk about that.
So my studio practice?
Yes, your studio practice. We'll lighten up for a minute and then we'll dive back in.
Really, for me, research is always an integral part of what I do. It's almost like, I love to just crosshatch and stuff like that, but I'm not an artist who kind of plays around and comes up with ideas through that. I always have an idea or something I'm upset about. And so I always feel that I have to do research because it always starts, it always starts intellectually. And it's one of the things I've actually liked about making art is that whatever I choose, I get to do all this research, which I love. So every day starts with reading for me. Lately, unfortunately, it's been far too much of the news, which is awful all the time these days and has been. And then from whatever research I do that day, I usually go into my studio until I've got a piece that I'm working on really going. And then, I sometimes come in the morning, but and just paint. But because I live in a space with my husband that is all workspace. I mean, the pandemic was it. Before that, it was like 60% workspace. Now the only place that really isn't is the bathroom in our bedroom. So I go in and out of the room that I'm in now that I consider my kind of painting studio. And usually for several hours during the day, in and out, because I do all this other stuff too. And then I have this unfortunate need to work in the early evening. So between 4 and 8 is my best work time. And it's really inconvenient, but that's when I'm happiest. When I'm in my studio in silence or with, the news or whatever.
Right.
Painting.
Well, let's keep going here. Let's talk about Promised Land, which is a piece that you did 2005 to 2007. And my God, talk about your medium. And it's also a very significant piece in terms of scale, 60 by 92.
Yeah. Promised Land's big. I mean, not huge, but big. And it's a piece for my father, for whom America was the promised land. And he really brought me up to adore this country. I mean, I swear he would have kissed the ground. He probably did at some point. He just loved America because he felt safe, and he had never felt safe as a young man. And that's what's his main goal, to keep his family safe. So Promised Land was the piece I did about his hopes and dreams. It's actually one of 2 I did. And it's light at the top and darker at the bottom. And that's to signify that, no promised land is what it's cracked up to be or what people hope. You know, the streets were not paved with gold in America, but it was a lot better than what he had at home when he was growing up. So, I mean, it was much better.
So it's a beautiful tribute piece, really, to him and your relationship to some degree, right?
Yeah, I loved him.
Let's talk about Unseeing Eyes, Unspeaking Lips, this title. My goodness, I love it.
That's really a piece about how many worlds exist on our earth. I don't know how to make sense out of the fact that I can live here and have a home and enough to eat, and in Syria and Ukraine, on the African continent, you know, all over the world, in Western China. There's horrible suffering. People are starving in Afghanistan. I just don't understand it. Why do I get to be fortunate in the way I am and they don't? What is that? And how can we be on the same planet and have this be okay?
And have such disparity.
Have such disparity. So Unseeing Eyes and Unspeaking Lips was about it's about our survival mechanism. Because, I mean, I drive myself crazy, and I wish I didn't, with, you know, thinking about this stuff. And I think it is really a defense to not listen, to not hear, to close one's eyes to the horror, because we cannot metabolize it all. So I think it's what we do, and I think it's not a great thing to do. And yet I don't think we could survive if we didn't, at least to a certain extent, close our eyes and close our ears for some time.
Well, I think you're also honoring, you know, how you feel about it. And you're also beckoning all of us, including yourself, not to forget. I mean,
right.
Let's keep going. Hiding Place.
So that was my response to the pandemic when I wanted to hide.
And we all did. Yeah.
Right for the 4 years before the pandemic, well, from 2016, I was working with people who were refugees who came to Gloucester totally unexpectedly from Syria and Afghanistan. And, you know, I was carrying a lot in those years. So by the time the pandemic hit, no one could see each other during the lockdown. It gave me a chance to kind of pull back and nurture myself in a way. And I just thought, I have to make myself a hiding place. But once I started, I couldn't make it just for myself. So I had to make it for all my friends and people I love, and, you know, anyone who needs a safe place to hide. And so this mountain I made is full of caves for people to hide in. And they're all sort of done with, I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this, but with sight lines thought out, so that, you know, how are we going to defend ourselves? Well, we can get, you know, invaders over there from this stairway and from this stairway.
Man, your mind is so fertile and so far reaching. And honestly, let's talk about where you are today.
Okay.
We have three more pieces that we want to also talk about, and how you make work for the times that we're living in. Let's kick off with war damage.
Oh, Kriegsschaden. Well, that's the German word for war damage. I worked for 8 years with a German painter who lived actually not in Germany anymore when we were working together. She lived half the time in Switzerland and Zurich, and half the time in Massachusetts. And what we did, basically, we decided to work together. We were showing together in Germany, her work on World War II, mine on the Holocaust. We were brought together by an art critic in Boston named Charles Giuliano, showed in his gallery in East Boston, and then we're invited to show in Leipzig, Germany together. And we did, and it was very intense. And at one point, we ran into both anti-Semitism and this wasn't at one point. At one point, sorry, we ran into anti-Semitism at one point on the part of a childhood friend of my painting partner, Erica's. And I didn't speak any German at the time, but at that point, I could tell that the friend was complaining, and I heard her say certain words that I recognized, and that she was complaining about Jewish people. And Erica got very upset, and we talked about it afterwards so that she could explain what had happened to me. And out of that conversation, we thought we should have our conversation visually. So we did that for many years. We didn't paint together, but we painted one after the other on the same canvases.
Oh, wow.
So we would trade back and forth. And when she was in America, that's when we would trade. This piece, Kriegsschaden, was one of our two kind of magnum opuses, I guess. One of which was 1,000 paintings total. And the other was this one. And this was basically where we were just letting go. And, you know, it almost got to the point in this painting where, as a friend of mine described it, he said, you know, Erica says, here's two skulls, and you say, okay, I'm meeting you, and I see you two skulls, and I'm upping it a skeleton, you know, and we just went back and forth like that until this crazy piece was finished. And we always decided together when it was finished, but it was really about the consequences of war, you know, and how it doesn't end when they don't end when the war ends. And it just goes on and on and on.
Let's keep it going. Fear, anger, hate. This is a work in progress.
Yes, so that's a piece I'm working on now. It's a text piece, but take another Abraham. It's just text at this point, anyway. It's big. It's 45 by 56 inches, and I was trying to figure out. This is the hardest work I think I've ever done. How to approach what's happening in our own country. Because everything I've worked on has been in the past.
Yes.
So hate, I believe, usually starts with fear. Fear of the other, fear of losing what you have, just fear that things are going to change. And out of that, I think as time goes on, people do get angry. And they start to make scapegoats for their troubles. And then comes the hate. And, you know, this piece I started in March of 2021. So it was not that long after the insurrection on January 6th of 2021. And that's what I was struggling with. And so now I've got, you know, fear, anger, and hate written, I don't know how many times on this huge piece of paper. And I'm kind of at a stopping point with it. I'll go back to it. And I'm thinking now that there's some other kind of emotional impact I need to bring into it, that it doesn't quite have just from the text. But it's really about my struggles with understanding the human capacity for hate.
Yes, right.
where it starts.
I
and
hear,
how to
I hear
prevent.
Yeah, I hear that clearly. Let's talk about January 6, 2021.
So this is
Hope I
sort
hope
of
I got
the
the
same
time correct.
story,
Also in process, right? In progress.
also in process. Yeah, it's probably a little farther along than the image you have, which is from a couple of weeks ago, I think. Boy, this was nothing I could approach in any way, literally. I thought of doing a mixed media piece, as I had done before, with troubling subjects, using my own photographs so that I didn't have to paint things that I found terrifying. Because painting is such an aesthetic process.
Yeah.
Paint is so wonderful.
Mhm.
And so it's a pretty abstract piece, and it's, as you can see, and it's about I don't have the right word. It's about the attack and the defense, except the defense is not working so well in this piece.
Mhm.
And that's my fear.
Mhm.
But that's the piece I'm really focusing on finishing right now.
Mhm.
And, I kind of look at it as it's getting there, but not there yet.
Mhm.
And that's a piece that scares me. I think more because of what it's about
Certainly. Certainly.
than the doing of it.
Let's talk about the work that you do that I think is so wonderful. Teaching English, right? Let's talk about that. That gives you a lot of joy, and I would love for our audience or listeners to also understand that side about you as well.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I am. After a pandemic hiatus, I can teach again. So right now, I'm only teaching one student, a Syrian woman who's become a friend. Her name is Siham. And I taught her for, I guess, 4 years before the pandemic, or 3 or something. And I thought when she came back, her English would be gone, once we started up again a couple of weeks ago, but it's not. And she's learning much better because she's been in America longer and she's heard it from her children. But the English class, or the English sessions I do, are under the auspices of Wellspring, which has a really wonderful volunteer program to teach English at the Sawyer Free Library. And it's a great program.
Well, it sounds like it gives you a lot of grounding too, right?
Oh,
and you're giving back and a certain amount of joy that you feel as a result of doing it.
I mean,
it fuels you with really wonderful energy. Susan, I want to thank you. What a wonderful, rich conversation. We could have dove into every single piece. I am sorry that we don't have enough time to do due diligence with all of your work. I want to thank you for sharing your story with me today and with our listeners.
Well, thank you so much. And I very much appreciated this. I still do appreciate this.
You're a remarkable painter. You really are. And you paint with courage, and you require the viewer to also step up and be courageous as one looks and processes. So thank you. And there's wonderful beauty in your work too. Really.
That's so important to me. Because who's going to look at it if there isn't?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So I want to thank you, Susan Erny. I want to thank our sponsors. For more of Susan's work, our listeners can view her work on the Matthew Swift Gallery URL, which is matthewswiftgallery.com. And for accessing this recording in the future, please take a look at the screen behind me with all of the different links and ways of being able to tap into this fabulous interview. Thank you, Susan. You are remarkable. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you, whoever's watching this.